Professor David Cannadine, we're going to talk about the coronation of Charles III and what you've written about, which is the invented tradition of the monarchy. What are you going to tell me?
I'm going to talk as a historian about the modern British monarchy as an institution, and in particular, I want to talk about the way in which the ceremonies associated with it are a very interesting amalgam of authentic continuity and constant change and reinvention.
David Cannadine, this is the first coronation in 70 years. That means, of course, for many of us, we've never actually witnessed one. You were on the coronation committee. Can you tell me a bit about that and what it did?
Well, of course, you're right to say it's 70 years and then some since the last coronation, whereas, of course, in the first half of the 20th century, there were coronations quite frequently. So this is a very different time we're in as a consequence of Queen Elizabeth II having reigned for so long. And you have to be at least my age, indeed a bit older than that, to remember the coronation of 1953. I was, as you mention, on a committee that was convened by the Archbishop of Canterbury under the name, I think, of Operation Golden Orb. We were asked to go through the service as it had been for Queen Elizabeth II to see how far it should be abbreviated and adjusted to take note of modern sensibilities. So there was quite a lot of pruning to do.
Because you've written that when it comes to rituals like coronations, the text of them remains the same, but the meaning changes in context. I mean, what do you think the context is now for the coronation of Charles?
Well, it's clearly a very different context, both domestically and internationally, from what it was for his mother over 70 years ago. Britain is no longer a great imperial power in the way that it still actually was in the early 1950s, or still certainly thought it was in the early 1950s. And of course, some corroboration to that was given by the fact that the news that a British-led expedition had conquered, as the word had it, Mount Everest. So in every sense, Britain seemed on top of the world. Britain was also, back in the early 1950s, still a very white country. It was outwardly much more conforming to the Christian religion as established by the Church of England. So that's a long way away. Britain is now a downsized nation in terms of its heft on the world stage. It's a multi-faith, multi-ethnic, multicultural nation. So that provides, I think, a rather different context to the impending coronation from the context for Queen Elizabeth II's over 70 years ago.
One of the things I want to talk about in the podcast is about what you've written about, which is sort of invented tradition, because reading around the sort of build up to the coronation, I was reading in one paper, they wrote, in just a few days' time, King Charles III will be crowned at Westminster Abbey. Like every coronation that has ever been held, it will be rich in tradition and history with rituals that go back hundreds of years. Is that true?
It is true, but it's not the whole truth of things. I mean, it's clearly the case that there are elements to the coronation service that are indeed genuinely old and antique across many centuries. The anointing of the sovereign with holy oil, the crowning, the presentation of the regalia, the homage, and so on. Those have been central elements to the coronation of English monarchs, then British monarchs, then indeed imperial monarchs for many centuries. But what has differed is that the text itself has in fact been abridged or elaborated at different times, and the performance of the coronation has ranged from flawlessly executed ritual to indifferently executed ceremony to downright farce and disaster, really. And the meaning of coronations has altered over time, depending on the broader context in which they take place. So there's a continued dialogue, I think, between continuity and change. And the area of this that I first became interested in was the belief that the British are good at ceremonial because they always have been. Well, they've had coronations for a very long time, but the notion of performing them well to a wide and ultimately global audience is very much an early 20th century invention.
Just one quick thing in terms of invented tradition. Some of it just happens by chance, it seems. The fact that, we're going to see Charles III in two carriages, the fact that as the rest of society stopped using carriages, the royal family carried on using them, meant it was more and more unique, and now it's seen as sort of a singular thing. So it feels like almost some of it was by chance and organic, or was some of it actually directed?
One of the elements of invented tradition is just carrying on doing things the way you did them before, if that doesn't sound paradoxical. That's to say, to keep using horses and carriages in the world of the motor car, the tram, aeroplanes, and so on, is very unusual and also very appealing. Although, of course, one of the carriages that they're going to use at the coronation has only been very recently made.
And has air conditioning.
And has air conditioning. So that's certainly an invented tradition. No doubt more such carriages made in the future. But continuing to use horses, for example, when most people no longer ride horses, although of course some people do, is clearly a way of giving a kind of sense of grandeur, a sense of occasion, and a sense of continuity with an earlier past. I mean, if they showed up at Westminster in a limousine, it wouldn't be anything like as spectacular. So that's one of the ways in which this continuing dialogue between continuity and change takes different forms at different times.
What does the coronation represent then in the 21st century, in a wholly different Britain? When Queen Elizabeth II was crowned, Britain still had colonies across the world, rationing was still in place, and we were not yet the diverse, multiracial nation we are today. In some ways, that coronation was a bridge between the two, a way for Britain to mark its imperial past as it began to move away from all of that. As our power began to wane, the coronation and the royals provided a way of reflecting on Britain's past. And the fact it was televised made people around the world see Britain in some ways as still that great power. Millions more will watch King Charles III's coronation, perhaps another moment for Britain to feel in some ways unique. But that could all change. The empire is now the Commonwealth, and while many members still have the monarch as head of state, some nations wish to move on. Charles's coronation comes at a time of heightened awareness about race, empire, slavery, and the lessons of the past, as well as a nation reeling from the cost of living crisis. What role does this coronation play compared to those of the past? As you were saying, some of the rituals, the ceremonies of the monarchy were farcical. When you started looking into this in sort of the early 19th century, can you go into what those ceremonies were like and some of those sort of farcical rituals?
Well, it's certainly true that the coronation of George IV was meant to be exceptionally grandiose and was in some ways very grandiose. A whole set of new costumes were created for the peerage and indeed for the monarch himself. But what made that coronation not entirely convincing, there was, as we would now say, a kind of credibility gap about it, was that the grandiosity didn't really square with the fact that the monarch wasn't very popular. And the coronation of William IV was known as the half-crownation because not much money was spent on it. And Victoria's coronation wasn't very well organised either. And there was a view, especially by the 1830s, that Britain was the most advanced nation in the world and that all this flummery wasn't appropriate for what was, by that time, the most advanced nation in the world. So those were some of the earlier mishaps which took place during the first part of the 19th century. And it was only in the later part of the 19th century, with the Golden Jubilee and the Diamond Jubilee, and then Victoria's funeral, and then Edward VII's coronation, that a sequence of events were developed where the ceremonial gradually got better. It's also important to stress that that was not only going on in the British monarchy, it was going on in the German monarchy, the Habsburg monarchy, and the Russian monarchy. And one of the things that makes British traditions seem in some senses older than they actually are, that's to say the tradition of doing ceremony well, is that after the First World War, the other great power ceremonially aggrandized monarchies, that's to say Austria-Hungary and Russia and Germany, disappeared. And Britain was left, in a way, as the only functioning great power European monarchy, complete with a set of grandiose ceremonies, which in many ways were themselves rather recent inventions.
So the idea that when we say, us Brits do it better than anyone else, it's because, well, we're the only ones left doing it.
Well, that is partly the case, yes. We do it better than anyone else because there's no one else. That, I think, is really the point, certainly in Europe, because it's also important to remember that the other monarchies of Europe now, which have survived, the Scandinavian monarchies in Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, the Belgian monarchy, the Netherlands monarchy, and the Spanish monarchy, they do not do coronations. So the British are now left as the only nation in the Western world which does coronations at all.
And the interesting thing there as well that you write about is that even before the collapse of some of the other European monarchies, when they were performing ritual, it was very much to sort of show off royal influence. Whereas when we were doing it, it wasn't necessarily about royal influence. It was about a waning political power.
Yes, I think that is right, that the monarchs of Russia and Germany and Austria-Hungary in the run-up to the First World War had far more power, perhaps regrettably given what happened in 1914, had far more power than by then the British monarchy did. And so the ceremonial that evolved and was elaborated in those countries for those monarchies related to, and I suppose helped legitimate, monarchies that wielded very serious and very considerable power, rather ineptly in 1914, it has to be said, and with very tragic consequences.
David, another big shift has been in what you write about is the role of the public and the press, because in the early 19th century, the press was very much more critical of the monarchy, and as you said earlier, the monarchy wasn't that popular. How has that shifted, and where does that fit in terms of the rituals? The idea is that, is it the idea, as you say, that as the political power decreased, that meant that people didn't mind the monarchy as much, which allowed us to be where we are now?
Well, it's certainly true that from, let us say, the 1880s to the early 1950s, on the whole, the press was much more deferential to the monarchy than it had been before. And it's also the case that, of course, by the time we reach the 1920s, a new form of media has come into being, that's to say the BBC. And the BBC under Sir John Reith was also pretty deferential to the monarchy. And so there was almost no coverage of Edward VIII's carrying on with Wallis Simpson until very late in what we now call the abdication affair, because the British newspapers and the BBC simply refused to report it. And that sense of media obsequiousness carried on all the way through to the Queen's coronation, and indeed carried on in some ways further on into her reign, exemplified, of course, by the commentaries of Richard Dimbleby. But I think in recent times it's fair to say that the media has in many ways become rather less deferential. And so there is discussion about the monarchy now in the media of the sort that it's hard to imagine taking place in the interwar years or even in the run-up to the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II.
And when it comes to, where we are today in terms of the role of ritual and ceremony within the monarchy and the current coronation, it seems to me that from your writing, Edward VII seems to be quite important in terms of some of the things that we saw, for example, at the funeral of Queen Elizabeth.
Yes, Edward VII's coronation and indeed his funeral was a major turning point in the efflorescence of ceremonial, or as we might say, the invention of tradition in the early 20th century. His coronation was a genuinely imperial coronation, in a way that the Queen Victoria's and William IV's certainly weren't. And of course, there is a composer called Edward Elgar, who is very much en song by that point, who composes the pomp and circumstance marches, of which Land of Hope and Glory is the most famous, with words added later. And so that's the beginning of this sequence of imperial coronations that runs all the way through to Elizabeth II. It's also the case that Edward VII was the first British monarch to lie in state in Westminster Hall. So that tradition, embodied in the Queen's lying in state last year, is only about 110 years old. So there was certainly a great deal of ceremonial inventiveness in that period of Edward VII's reign. Elgar was a major player in every sense, and Lord Esher, who was a major figure in the background, was also a very considerable ceremonial impresario. And that was a very significant time for the invention of tradition. I think something else that's worth pondering is that the context in which these ceremonies need to be thought about isn't just the nation or perhaps the empire. It's also what's going on in Europe. One of the appeals of British royal ceremony in the 1920s and 30s is that it seemed very sober, very restrained, very anachronistic, lots of horses, compared to the kind of high-tech ceremonials of Stalin's Russia, Mussolini's Italy, and above all Hitler's Germany. I mean, the coronation, as it were, of George VI and Queen Elizabeth was about as far away in performance, in technology, and in spirit from the Nuremberg rallies of Hitler as you could possibly imagine. And that was thought to provide some reassurance about British decency while the continent was going to the dogs.
Let's move on then to Charles III's coronation. I mean, you wrote about how important Elizabeth II's coronation was in terms of sort of forging a British identity after the war, along with decolonisation, etc. Does that mean that Charles's coronation is similarly going to have a role, or did that come down to the fact that Elizabeth was a much younger person at a much more sort of turbulent time of change? Does Charles's coronation have a similar level of almost symbolism?
It's clear the case that one of the ways in which coronations are thought about is the age of the person being crowned. And it's clear that in 1953, the Queen was barely in her mid-20s. There was this hope of a bright young future with this young and glamorous woman and her young and no less handsome husband, and that a new Elizabethan age would dawn. Well, the Suez Crisis comes only 3 years later, which shows that the new Elizabethan age hadn't dawned. And the point that example makes, and I'll come to Charles III in a minute, is that the meanings of coronations are in part determined by how people respond on the day, but they're in part determined by what comes after. So that Elizabeth's coronation at the time seemed to be this great overdue party. There was a belief that the new Elizabethan age was round the corner. But in retrospect, Elizabeth's coronation looks very different, that it's, as it were, a rather sad assertion of imperial grandeur, which is very soon disproved. And so the theme of Elizabeth's reign was not another Elizabethan age. It was the downsizing of Britain, the downsizing of the British Empire, and belatedly, in the final decades of her reign, to some degree, the downsizing of her monarchy. So that casts a kind of retrospective reinterpretation on the coronation that wasn't how it was thought of at the time. So on to King Charles III. Well, he's in his mid-70s, not his mid-20s. So we can't realistically expect his reign to be anything like as long as his mother's. How are we thinking about his coronation? I think there's a great deal of enthusiasm in certain quarters. There is perhaps a certain degree of criticism in other quarters that may be more vociferous than it was back in 1953, though I'm in no position to judge that. But I think that the meaning of his coronation will in part depend on how his reign unfolds, how he copes with the fact that some people think the monarchy has got too much money, the problems of the Duke of York and Prince Harry, whether certain of what used to be called the dominions become republics, the future of the Commonwealth, maybe, though this seems on the back burner at the moment, the future of the union with Scotland.
Can his coronation, though, in its ceremony, actually address such monumental questions? I mean, we've already seen, when it comes to ideas about the Commonwealth and history and empire and slavery, they're not using the crown of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, because it has the Kohinoor diamond, which was taken from India. I know that the palace is also cooperating with an independent study looking into the relationship between the monarchy and the slave trade. I mean, does any of that tell us how Charles III will look at his reign? And does, the fact that they're not going to use that crown and that diamond, does that indicate something about this coronation as well?
I think it certainly shows that the king is sensitive to these issues and is to some degree recognizing their significance. But I think that that's all of a piece with the fact that this is the first post-imperial coronation following that sequence of imperial coronations of Edward VII, George V, George VI, and Queen Elizabeth. And part of the post-imperial mood is indeed to be concerned with these issues such as slavery and the Koh-i-Noor diamond. I think that's right. I think, of course, it's also the case that this is going to be a far less grandiose and ostentatious coronation. 8,000 people were crammed into Westminster Abbey for Queen Elizabeth II's coronation. The Abbey was closed for over a year to fit it out, to build all the extra galleries that were needed to accommodate so many people. It's 2,000 people this time. It's much, much smaller. All the House of Lords was present at Queen Elizabeth II's coronation. That's not true this time. There are far fewer troops going to be on parade because there are far fewer troops in the British Army, and there won't be colonial contingents in the way that they were in 1953. And the procession itself is going to be on a shorter route. So it's going to be very much a downsized post-imperial coronation. And I think that's right. I think that had it not been downsized, had it been still pretentiously imperial, there would have been a big credibility gap between the grandiosity of the coronation and the diminished status of Britain in the world today. And I hope that means that there won't be a credibility gap between the pretensions and ceremonies of the coronation and the world and the country we're in today.
On Saturday, the 6th of May, King Charles III will be crowned at Westminster Abbey, the 40th coronation to take place there, and the first this century. Before the ceremony, the King and Queen Consort will proceed through the crowd-lined streets from Buckingham Palace to Westminster Abbey. They'll be travelling in the Diamond Jubilee State Coach. That's the modern one that has electric windows and air conditioning. The coronation service at the Abbey will see King Charles III take the oath, the anointing, and then the crowning. He'll sit at 3 different chairs, from the chair of estate to the coronation chair to the King's new throne. Camilla will also be crowned Queen. Then there'll be the coronation procession from Westminster Abbey back to Buckingham Palace, this time in the Gold State Coach, a carriage dating from the 18th century and which is a lot more uncomfortable than the other one. And so that procession route will be much shorter than the 5-mile route taken by the Queen back in 1953. The new King and Queen will greet the crowds on the Buckingham Palace balcony and they'll witness a flypast of roughly 60 aircraft. I guess finally, Professor, I'd actually like to sort of perhaps quote your wife, or another acclaimed historian, Linda Colley, who, when she talks about British identity, talks about how it's often been formed as opposed to something else, British identity forged during wars, and how in the last sort of 70 years we haven't had a major war, so therefore British identity hasn't had some sort of glue. Can one determine then finally that events like the coronation or the death of the Queen, these royal rituals, have now got even more symbolic importance as something which creates some form of British identity at a time when it feels like there isn't any other glue there?
One of the things that I suppose became significant was the growing hostility to the European Union. And clearly, part of what has been going on over the last 15, 20 years was an attempt to produce a redefined sense of Britishness in opposition to the European Union. And that, in some senses, is what Brexit was about. But of course, that was not a view universally shared. As for a sense of British identity today, I think it's a much more complicated issue, partly because Britain is now a multicultural, multi-faith, multi-ethnic country on a scale that it certainly wasn't in the 18th or 19th or the first half of the 20th century. So that makes trying to forge a monolithic sense of British identity much harder. But clearly, notions of identity, notions of multiple identities have become much more salient over the last maybe 25 years, and therefore creating or articulating or representing symbols of national unity has got a lot harder. I think it is clear that the Queen's funeral and her more extended obsequies did create not a near universal, but I should have thought a close to universal national mood. Whether the coronation will do the same. We'll have to wait and see.
Professor David Cannadine, thank you for talking to me today. Thank you.
Thank you.